Welcome to your mid-level English Praxis preparation. In this module, we will look at poetry structure, poetry terms, and poetry analysis. Poetry and vocabulary. When you start learning poetry, the most important thing you can do is to learn the vocabulary of poetry. Whether it's sports, music, or a professional field, most areas of study have a vocabulary that is specific to that area of study. Poetry is no different. If you wish to analyze poetry effectively, you must first become familiar with the vocabulary associated with the field of study. While the words may seem unfamiliar, the concepts behind them are very straightforward. Analyzing a poem, rhyme scheme, and sonnet. The rhyme scheme of a poem refers to the pattern of rhyming lines. Certain predictable rhyme schemes are used to classify poems into categories. The poem you see to the left is Sonnet 18 by William Shakespeare. Shakespearean sonnets are poems of 14 lines that have the rhyme scheme AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, G, G. As you look at the poem, you'll notice that the words day and may rhyme. They're both classified with the letter A. Then you'll notice that temperate and date are classified with the letter B. While these words may not sound like a rhyme in the pronunciation of many American dialects, you'll notice that the letters ATE end each word, so they are still rhyming words. If you look in the second stanza, you'll notice once again that the first and third and second and fourth lines rhyme, and you'll see that pattern repeated in the third stanza as well. You'll also notice at the end, the two lines have rhyming words that end the poem. This pattern is typical of any Shakespearean sonnet that you'll encounter. Analyzing a poem, quatrains and couplets. You'll notice that the poem is divided into 3 groups of 4 lines each, and 1 group of 2 lines at the end, based on its rhyme scheme. The first 3 stanzas are called quatrains because of their 4 lines. The final stanza is called a rhyming couplet, named for its 2 rhyming lines. Meter. Meter focuses on the predictable pattern of stressed or emphasized and unstressed or less emphasized syllables within a line. Say the word compare. Now, say the word again, but place the emphasis on the first syllable. Compare. Do you notice that the second one sounds odd? As you can see, in speech, we have a natural tendency to place emphasis on certain syllables, while we give less emphasis to others. Poets and songwriters are aware of this tendency to emphasize certain parts of words, so they choose words based not only on their meaning, but also on the pattern of syllables that make up the word. This creates a natural meter or rhythm to poetry when it is read aloud. Consider the following lines from Shakespeare's sonnet. Shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. You will notice that the pattern is 1 unaccented syllable followed by 1 accented syllable. This creates a rhythm when the poem is read aloud. Different patterns have different names. The pattern of unaccented syllable followed by an accented syllable is called an iamb. Since each line of poetry consists of 5 iambs, you will hear it referred to as pentameter, or a meter made up of 5 patterns. Each pattern is called a metric foot, meaning 1 repetition of the poetic pattern. Shakespeare's sonnets are said to be written in iambic pentameter, because the lines contain 5 repetitions or metric feet of the iamb pattern. Tone, mood, and theme. While many of the elements that we've discussed so far refer to only specific parts of the poem, the tone, mood, and theme refer to the poem as a whole. The tone is the author's attitude about the subject. Note that the author's attitude may not match the mood, which is the reader's response. For example, one might read a speech by a dictator that has a very angry tone, but the reader's mood may be one of sorrow that such a terrible person could have risen to power. The theme is usually some larger truth about human experience that is revealed in the poem. Remember that theme is usually something that needs to be expressed in a statement rather than a single word. For example, the topic of a poem may be love, but the theme might be people will do anything for love, or love can leave a person broken. Theme is usually a more complete and complex idea than a simple topic. Types of poems. You'll remember the first poem that we looked at was called a sonnet, and we were able to identify it by its rhyme scheme. Another common type of poem is the ballad. A ballad is a narrative poem that tells a story. Ballads are usually written in quatrains and also have a predictable rhyme scheme. Note that in this one, the second and fourth lines always rhyme. The haiku is another common type of poem. The haiku is a Japanese poetic form with 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables. As you can see in the example, a haiku is a very short poem. Unlike a ballad, which tells a long narrative, a haiku captures a specific moment in time and conveys the author's experience of that moment. You may be given a poem and ask what you would have to change to make it a haiku. To answer this type of question, you will need to know the number of syllables that should be in each line. Common poetic devices. Poetic devices are the tools that writers use to help create poetry. The first poetic device that we will look at is alliteration. Alliteration is the repetition of an initial sound. Consider the example, round the rugged rock, the ragged rascal ran. You'll notice the repetition of the initial R sound in each word. The next device we will look at is repetition. Repetition, as the name suggests, means using words repeatedly to emphasize an idea, or even repeating a word to the point that you lose the meaning of the word and you only notice its sound. Consider this example. The sun shines, the sun is hidden, the sun returns, the world goes on. You notice in this example the repetition of sun to indicate different stages of a person's experience shows the continuity of time and that the world goes on no matter what's happening. The next poetic device is metaphor. A metaphor is a comparison that states one thing is something else. Consider this example. My tears are rain that fall by night. Notice that in the metaphor it clearly says my tears are rain. It doesn't say that my tears are like rain or that my tears are similar to rain, but that my tears are rain. A simile, very similar to a metaphor, is also a comparison. But unlike a metaphor, a simile is a comparison that says something is like or as something else. To write the same line with a simile, I would say, "My tears are like rain that falls by night." You notice these are very similar because they both make comparisons. The biggest difference is that use of like or as versus saying that one thing is something else. The next term we'll look at is onomatopoeia. This is a word that represents a sound. Buzz, buzz, buzz goes the bee. If I asked you to define the word buzz, it would be hard to give it a definition outside of a description of the sound, or perhaps examples of things that make that sound. That's because it's an onomatopoetic word. It's a word whose only meaning is to describe a sound. Words like pop, splat, whap are all examples of onomatopoeia. A hyperbole, and please notice the pronunciation is hyperbole, not hyperbole, is a deliberate exaggeration used to make a point. My father stood a mile high and looked way down at me. In this example, we're being given a child's view of their parent. Obviously, the parent isn't truly a mile tall, but from the child's perspective, this hyperbole is being used to emphasize how tall the child felt the father looked. Next, personification is giving human traits to something that is not human. For example, the sun smiled on us as we walked the path. Obviously, smiling is a human facial expression and not something that the sun is capable of doing. However, in this example, the idea of the sun smiling on us conveys how the author feels about the experience of walking in the sunshine. Let's review some of the poetry terms that we have looked at so far and add a few new ones that you'll need to know for your exam. You've heard me refer to a stanza. A stanza is a group of lines that form the basic unit of a poem. When you think of a stanza, it might help to think of it as a paragraph in poetry. Just as prose is divided into paragraphs, poetry is divided into stanzas. Verse is a single metrical line of a poem. You remember when we looked at Shakespeare's poem, we talked about it being written in iambic pentameter, and we said that each verse consisted of 5 iambic feet. Meter is the rhythmic pattern in a poem formed by the accented and unaccented syllables in the words. Poetic devices are conventional tools of writing used by poets to convey meaning. The rhyme scheme of a poem is the pattern of rhyming words at the end of the lines of poetry. Internal rhyme scheme is a pattern of rhyming words within the same line. An interrogative is a phrase, stanza, or poem that poses a question. For example, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? This would be an interrogative. A rhetorical question is a question that the reader is asked to consider, but which the reader is not actually expected to answer out loud. An imperative is a command, direction, or a strong request or a suggestion. Continuing our review, a quatrain is a stanza consisting of 4 lines. Now, one of the many misconceptions that you find when people begin to study poetry is that they think all poetry has to rhyme. That's really not true. Blank verse is poetry that still follows a predictable pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables, but it doesn't end in rhyming words. A sonnet, as we looked at early on, is a poem with 14 lines and a predictable rhyme scheme, with 10 syllables per line. A ballad is a narrative poem in a musical style with a predictable rhyme scheme. When we look at haiku, remember that the numbers are essential. Haiku is a Japanese poetic form with 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, and the third line has 5 syllables. For this definition, it is absolutely essential that you remember the number of syllables in each line. Structure. The structure of a poem refers to the stanzas, the rhyme scheme, the meter, and the line breaks. On these final definitions, note that these elements are focused on the poem as a whole rather than on individual parts. Tone is the writer's attitude as revealed by the word choice, setting, and structure. Mood is the response that the poem evokes in the reader. Note that the tone and the mood may not be the same. The writer could be angry, but the angry tone could evoke feelings of sadness or regret in the reader. Theme is the broader truth about human nature that is revealed by the poem. Remember that theme will usually be written as a thematic statement rather than as a single word that describes the topic. The next several slides will give you review questions. After each review question, you will be given the answer. It is highly recommended that you have your remote in hand and that you pause the slide to give everyone time to answer the question before moving on to look at the correct answer and to hear the explanation. Let's begin with review question 1. Which of the following refers to the sound pattern found by comparing the final word of each line? The meter, the stanza, the rhyme scheme, or the quatrain? Pause the slideshow now. Take time to answer the question, and then let's take a look at the correct answer. If you said the rhyme scheme, then you are correct. Notice the question specifically asked about the sound pattern in the final word of each line. You'll remember that meter refers to the repetition of stressed and unstressed syllables. Stanzas are groupings of lines in a poem similar to paragraphs in prose, and a quatrain is a specific type of stanza that consists of 4 lines. The rhyme scheme is the sound pattern found by comparing the final word of each line. Which of the following is not a characteristic of a Shakespearean sonnet? Please note the word not in this question, meaning that 3 of these will be characteristics of a sonnet and only 1 will not. A. 14 lines long. B. Written in free verse. C. Consists of 3 quatrains and a rhyming couplet. Or D. The rhyme scheme A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. Of the options below, the one that is not a characteristic of a Shakespearean sonnet is being written in free verse. You'll remember that Shakespearean sonnets do have a predictable rhyme scheme, which is the opposite of being written in free verse. Shakespearean sonnets are 14 lines long, and they do consist of 3 quatrains with a rhyming couplet. What is meter in a poem? A. The sound pattern found by comparing the final word of each line. B. The predictable pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables within a line. C. A predictable number of lines that appears in each quatrain. Or D. The practice of separating the quatrains from the final rhyming couplet by one poetic meter. The meter of a poem is the predictable pattern of stressed and unstressed syllables within a line. The sound pattern found by comparing the final word of each line is the rhyme scheme, and a predictable number of lines that appear in each quatrain is obvious by the definition of a quatrain, because they contain 4 lines. Option D, the practice of separating quatrains from the final rhyming couplet by one poetic meter, is a nonsense answer because poetic meter doesn't separate things. Poetic meter refers to the pattern of metric feet in a line. One important thing to note about option D is that although it has no meaning, it looks correct because it uses familiar poetry terms. This is a very important test-taking strategy to master. Just because a line contains things that look familiar, it doesn't mean that the answer is correct. Read carefully for your exam, and read each answer for meaning. Don't simply pick an answer because the words look familiar. Where do quatrains and couplets get their names? From the number of syllables in each line, from the number of total lines in the poem, from the number of stanzas in the poem, or from the number of lines in the stanza. Quatrains and couplets get their names from the number of lines in the stanza. Remember that the number of syllables in each line refers to the meter of the poem. Remember that the total number of lines in the poem may indicate what type of poem it is, but it has nothing to do with quatrain and couplet. And the number of stanzas in the poem also has nothing to do with quatrain and couplet. So for us, the number of lines in the stanza is the only correct answer option. What metric pattern is present in the lines below? Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. A. A rhyming couplet. B. A spondaic tetrameter. C. Iambic pentameter. Or D. Trochaic heptameter. The metric pattern in these lines is iambic pentameter. You'll notice that the other words are structured similarly. Spondaic and trochaic refer to different patterns of accented and unaccented syllables. Tetrameter and heptameter refer to different numbers of repetitions of the feet within a line. But these 2 lines from Shakespeare represent iambic pentameter. What is iambic pentameter? A pattern of 5 metric feet of poetry consisting of 1 unstressed syllable followed by 1 stressed syllable. A pattern of 4 metric quatrains that ends with a rhythmic couplet. A pattern of 3 metric feet repeated for 5 lines that begins with a couplet. Or a pattern of 2 iambic feet followed by 2 trochaic feet for 5 lines. Iambic pentameter is a pattern of 5 metric feet of poetry consisting of 1 unstressed syllable followed by 1 stressed syllable. You'll notice that the answers that are wrong have either the wrong terminology or the wrong numbers. For iambic pentameter, it's very important to remember the number of feet per line, thus the penta, and the pattern of unstressed and stressed syllables, the iamb. This pattern makes up iambic pentameter. Identify the poetic device represented by each of the following pieces of text. She sells seashells by the seashore. The shells she sells are seashells, I'm sure. So if she sells seashells on the seashore, then I'm sure she sells seashore shells. Terry Sullivan, 1909. Would this be an example of alliteration, iambic pentameter, hyperbole, or simile? As you can see in the example, she sells seashells by the seashore. You have a repetition of an initial sound. This is alliteration. You'll remember that iambic pentameter refers to the pattern of accented and unaccented syllables and the number of feet per line. You'll remember that a hyperbole is an exaggeration used to make a point, and a simile is a comparison that uses like or as. Identify the poetic device or devices represented by each of the following pieces of text. Hint: this has more than one. Keeping time in a sort of runic rhyme to the tintinnabulation that so musically swells from the bells, 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 from the jingling and the tinkling of the bells. Edgar Allan Poe, 1850. Would this be alliteration, personification, repetition, or metaphor? In the poem above, you will notice the repetition of the bells, bells, bells. Notice that in this example, repetition is the only correct answer available. However, it is important to note that the repetition of a sound such as this could also be termed alliteration, and that's why you are not asked to choose between alliteration and repetition. While these can be used together, as they were in this example, it is very important that you know the difference. Repetition refers to a word or phrase, while alliteration refers to a sound that may occur in different words or phrases. Identify the poetic devices represented by each of the following pieces of text. Oh, my love is like a red, red rose that's newly sprung in June. Oh, my love is like the melody that's sweetly played in tune. Robert Burns. Is this an example of a simile, a metaphor, alliteration, or onomatopoeia? As you can see in the poem that is highlighted, my love is like a red, red rose. My love is like the melody. A comparison using like or as is a simile. Note that if the poem had said my love is a red rose or my love is the melody, it would have been a metaphor, but by using like or as in the comparison, it is a simile. Identify the poetic device represented in the following text. Hope is a thing with feathers that perches in the soul, and sings the tune without the words, and never stops at all. Is this an example of a simile, a metaphor, alliteration, or onomatopoeia? Note that the text says that hope is the thing with feathers. This is an example of a metaphor. Note the use of the word is. A simile uses like or as, but a metaphor says one thing is something else. In this case, hope is the thing with feathers. So the correct answer for this is metaphor. Identify the poetic device in the text. I heard a fly buzz when I died. The stillness in the room was like the stillness in the air between the heaves of storm. Note, in this question, the word buzz represents the sound that the fly made. This is an example of onomatopoeia, or a word whose definition is the description of a sound. Identify the poetic device in the following passage. Here once the embattled farmer stood and fired the shot heard round the world. Ralph Waldo Emerson. Is this an example of a simile, a metaphor, a hyperbole, or alliteration? The shot heard round the world is an example of hyperbole, or an exaggeration used to make a point. While the shot fired that Emerson describes did have implications that were felt worldwide, the shot itself would not have been heard all the way around the world. Therefore, this is an exaggeration used to make a point, and it is an example of hyperbole. Identify the poetic device highlighted in the text below. I wandered lonely as a cloud that floats on high o'er vales and hills, when all at once I saw a crowd, a host of golden daffodils, beside the lake beneath the trees, fluttering and dancing in the breeze. Is this an example of personification, alliteration, hyperbole, or metaphor? Looking at the highlighted portions, lonely being used to describe a cloud, crowd being used to describe daffodils, and host being used to describe daffodils, and the action dancing being attributed to the daffodils, are all examples of personification. Lonely would normally describe the emotion of a person. Crowd and host are words used to describe groups of people, and dancing is an action normally associated with human beings. Therefore, these are examples of personification, or human-like qualities being attributed to things that are not human. What is the tone of the following passage? During the whole of a dull, dark, and soundless day in the autumn of the year, when the clouds hung oppressively low in the heavens, I had been passing alone on horseback through a singularly dreary tract of country, and at length found myself, as the shades of evening drew on, within view of the melancholy house of Usher. Is the tone of this passage joyful, angry, gloomy, or hopeful? Remember, when we talk about tone, we're talking about the author, not the reader. The author's tone in this passage, describing the dull, dark, and soundless day, the oppressively low clouds, being alone on horseback, the dreary tract of country, and the melancholy house, create a tone that's best described as gloomy. Once again, remember, tone is focused on the author's feeling as the author is writing the passage. What mood is the passage designed to evoke in the reader? Is life so dear, or peace so sweet, as to be purchased at the price of chains and slavery? Forbid it, Almighty God. I know not what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. Patrick Henry. Is the mood this passage is designed to evoke in the reader a mood of anger, comfort, peace, or contentment? Remember, mood is what it's designed to evoke in the reader. The mood this passage is designed to evoke in the reader is anger. Patrick Henry was speaking to the Virginia Convention and sought to make the other colonists angry so that they would answer his call to revolution and help fight against the British king. What is the theme of the passage? Alas, alas, how very soon this silly little fly, hearing his wily flattering words, came slowly flitting by. With buzzing wings she hung aloft, then nearer and nearer drew, thinking only of her brilliant eyes and her green and purple hue, thinking only of her crested head, poor foolish thing. At last up jumped the cunning spider and fiercely held her fast. He dragged her up his winding stair into his dismal den, within his little parlor, but she ne'er came out again. Mary Howlett. What is the theme of this passage? Spiders eating flies is a natural process and not a bad thing. Flies are generally dumb and do not make good decisions. Listening to flattering words can lead you to destruction. Or, spiders aren't nice and tend to bully flies, but only in parlors. One of the important things to remember about theme is that it will never be specific to a character or to a passage. Theme is a general statement about human life or human experience. In the case of all three wrong answers, they're specific to spiders and flies. The correct answer is C. Listening to flattering words can lead you to destruction. This theme is illustrated by the fly being lured into the parlor and eaten by the spider through flattery. Notice that the theme is not a single word, and the theme is not specific only to this passage. The theme could be applied to any number of other stories as well. Which of the following are characteristics of a ballad? Select all that apply. AB, AB, CD, CD, EF, EF, GG rhyme scheme. Has a narrative structure and tells a story. Written in quatrains with a predictable rhyme scheme. Or has a rhythmic pattern that can be set to music. Remember, select all that apply. The correct answer for this is B, C, and D. A ballad has a narrative structure and tells a story. It is written in quatrains, and it does have a predictable rhyme scheme, and it does have a rhythmic pattern that can be set to music. Letter A, the rhyme scheme described, would apply not to a ballad, but to a sonnet. Which of the following are characteristic of a haiku? Select all that apply. A Mesopotamian poetic form with 3 lines. The first line has 5 syllables, the second line has 7 syllables, the third line has 5 syllables. Remember, select all that apply. The correct answer to the characteristics of a haiku lie in the numbers. The first line does have 5 syllables, the second line has 7, and the third line has 5. Note that instead of Mesopotamian, haikus are a Japanese poetic form consisting of 3 lines. Prose passages. You will be given passages to read and asked to answer questions that fit into 3 general categories. The first is summary and main idea. These questions will ask you to summarize information presented in a passage or paragraph, or to determine the main idea of a passage and to be able to differentiate that from the supporting details. The second category of questions focuses on the supporting details. These questions will ask you to identify supporting details in a passage and to evaluate whether or not new information supports the main idea of a passage. The final category are inference questions. These questions will ask you to use information in the passage to make a logical inference about something that is not explicitly stated in the passage. Main idea and summary question strategies. The purpose of a summary question is to test your ability to differentiate between a summary that addresses the passage as a whole and a supporting detail that only addresses one aspect of the passage. Remember that most wrong answers will still be relevant to the passage, but they may only focus on a specific detail or a small part of the passage, rather than focusing on the passage as a whole. Supporting detail questions. These questions will take several forms. Some will ask you to deal with text from the passage. Below are some examples of question stems that you will find with supporting detail questions. Which excerpt from the passage supports the conclusion that blank is best supported by blank? Other questions will ask you to relate the passage to outside information. Which of the following provides the strongest evidence to support the author's argument? Which is most relevant to the essay? Which could you add as a supporting detail? And which of the following statements, inferences, or claims is best supported by the passage? You should become familiar with these question stems because they can be applied to many different types of passages. Supporting detail question strategies. There's a two-step process that's very helpful in answering supporting detail questions. Step 1 is to read and to comprehend the passage. Step 2 is to evaluate or extend and then answer. The most important thing to remember on supporting detail questions is to avoid the word search strategy, where you look for an answer that has wording similar to the passage. Usually, all of the answers will use wording that is similar to the passage because the test makers want to ensure that you understand the meaning of what you are reading. The purpose of these questions is to test your reading comprehension and logical reasoning. Therefore, just because an answer looks similar to something that you read in the passage, don't assume that that answer is correct. Inference question strategy. Inference questions ask you to make a logical conclusion based on what you have read in the passage. For example, if you read, Sally walked into the room wearing a dripping rain jacket, rubber boots, and carrying an umbrella, what could you infer based on this information? Logically, you could infer that it is probably raining. Inference versus proof. It's important to remember that an inference is based on textual evidence, but an inference is not something that can be proved from the text. Can I prove beyond a doubt that it is raining based on the evidence in the passage? No. It's entirely possible that there's a person outside spraying passers-by with a garden hose, and Sally happened to have the appropriate rain gear in her car, so she dressed like this to protect herself. That being said, an inference isn't based on what if or possible exceptions. Instead, an inference is based on a conclusion that a reasonable person would make based on the evidence that has been presented. While the garden hose theory is totally possible, we have no specific evidence to support it. Generally, we can't anticipate random people with garden hoses when we get dressed in the morning, but we can anticipate the weather. Therefore, the most logical inference, based on available evidence, is that Sally's wardrobe reflects the weather outdoors. Don't overthink an inference. Go with the most logical and straightforward extension of the information provided in the passage. Take a moment to read the following passage from Anne of Green Gables by Lucy Maud Montgomery. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea Main Road dipped down into a little hollow, fringed with alders and ladies' eardrops, and traversed by a brook that had its source away back in the woods of the old Culbreth place. It was reputed to be an intricate, headlong brook in its earlier course through the woods, with dark secrets of pool and cascade. But by the time it reached Lynn's Hollow, it was a quiet, well-conducted little stream, for not even a brook could run past Mrs. Rachel Lynde's door without due regard for decency and decorum. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed, from brooks and children up, and that if she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. There are plenty of people in Avonlea, and out of it, who can attend closely to their neighbor's business by dint of neglecting their own. But Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who manage their own concerns and those of other folks into the bargain. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. She ran the sewing circle, helped run the Sunday school, and was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Yet with all this, Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. She had knitted 16 of them, as Avonlea housekeepers were wont to tell in odd voices, and keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hills beyond. Since Avonlea occupied a little triangular peninsula jutting out into the Gulf of St. Lawrence, with water on two sides of it, anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road, and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. Question number 1. Summary. What is the main idea of the passage about Mrs. Rachel Lynde? A. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a good friend who cares about others and tries to help them. B. Mrs. Rachel Lynde lived just where the Avonlea Main Road dipped down into a little hollow. C. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a nosy neighbor who spends her time looking, observing, and judging others based on her idea of decency and decorum. Or D. Mrs. Rachel Lynde suffers from a serious illness that doesn't allow her to leave her home, so she sits in the window knitting cotton warp quilts. The correct answer to this question is C. Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a nosy neighbor who spends her time looking, observing, and judging others based on her idea of decency and decorum. Note that the wrong answers reference specific details rather than the entire passage. Option A, Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a friend who cares about others, is implied in the passage. Option B is stated in the passage that she does live where the Avonlea Main Road dipped down into a hollow. Option D is partially correct. While there is no mention of a serious illness, the text does mention that she knits cotton warp quilts. It's important to remember that on summary questions, many of the wrong answers will focus on specific details or will be partially correct and partially incorrect. When you answer these questions, read carefully to make sure that every part of an answer is true and that the answer refers to the passage as a whole, not simply to a specific detail. Question 2. Supporting details. Which of the following details does not support the idea that Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a person who attended closely to their neighbor's business? A. It probably was conscious that Mrs. Rachel was sitting at her window, keeping a sharp eye on everything that passed. B. If she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. C. Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who managed their own concerns. Or D. Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her window, keeping a sharp eye on the main road that crossed the hollow and wound up the steep red hill beyond. The correct answer to this question is C. The detail that does not support the idea that Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a person who attended closely to her neighbor's business says that Mrs. Rachel Lynde was one of those capable creatures who can manage their own concerns. You'll notice that options A, B, and D all refer to her concern with others. Option C refers to her ability to manage her own concerns. Question 3. Supporting details. Select all of the details that support the idea that Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a person who can manage their own concerns. A. She ran the sewing circle. B. Helped run the Sunday school. C. Was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Or D. If she noticed anything odd or out of place, she would never rest until she had ferreted out the whys and wherefores thereof. The correct answer to question 3 is A, B, and C. All three of these details support the idea that Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a person who can manage her own concerns. She was concerned with running the sewing circle. She was concerned with the Church Aid Society and the Foreign Missions Auxiliary, and she was concerned with helping to run the Sunday school. However, option D refers to her concern with other people's business and her desire to know their reasons why. Question 4. Inferences. Which of the following pieces of evidence leads us to conclude that Mrs. Rachel Lynde is a judgmental person? Mrs. Rachel found abundant time to sit for hours at her kitchen window, knitting cotton warp quilts. B. She was a notable housewife. Her work was always done and well done. C. She was the strongest prop of the Church Aid Society and Foreign Missions Auxiliary. Or D. Anybody who went out of or into it had to pass over that hill road and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. The correct answer is D. Anybody who went out of it or into it had to pass over that hill road and so run the unseen gauntlet of Mrs. Rachel's all-seeing eye. Notice that this is still an inference because the text does not explicitly state that Mrs. Rachel is judgmental. It does, however, refer to her all-seeing eye as an unseen gauntlet or test. So we can infer from that statement that she is very judgmental toward the people that she's observing. The following text is from The Yellow Wallpaper by Charlotte Perkins Gilman. I don't like our room a bit. I wanted one downstairs that opened onto the piazza and had roses all over the window and such pretty old-fashioned chintz hangings, but John wouldn't hear of it. He said there was only one window and not room for 2 beds, and no near room for him if he took another. He's very careful and loving and hardly lets me stir without special direction. I have a schedule prescription for every hour in the day. He takes all care from me, and so I feel basely ungrateful not to value it more. He said we came here solely on my account, that I was to have perfect rest and all the air I could get. Your exercise depends on your strength, my dear, he said, and your food somewhat on your appetite, but air you can absorb all the time. So we took the nursery at the top of the house. It is a big, airy room, the whole floor nearly, with windows that look all ways, and air and sunshine galore. And there are rings and things in the walls. It was a nursery first, and then playground and gymnasium, I should judge, for the windows are barred for little children. The paint and paper look as if a boys' school had used it. It is stripped off, the paper, in great patches all around the head of my bed, about as far as I can reach, and in a great place on the other side of the room, low down. I never saw a worse paper in my life. One of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. It is dull enough to confuse the eye in following, pronounced enough to constantly irritate and provoke study, and when you follow the lame, uncertain curves for a little distance, they suddenly commit suicide, plunging off at outrageous angles, destroy themselves in unheard-of contradictions. The color is repellent, almost revolting, a smoldering, unclean yellow, strangely faded by the slow-turning sunlight. It is a dull yet lurid orange in some places, a sickly sulphur tint in others. No wonder the children hated it. I should hate it myself if I had to live in this room long. There comes John, and I must put this away. He hates to have me write a word. Question 5. Summary. What is the main idea of this passage? A. The narrator dislikes the room in which she is staying. B. The narrator has a bad relationship with her husband. C. The narrator seems to be recovering from an illness. Or D. The narrator wishes to be a writer. The correct answer is A. The narrator dislikes the room in which she is staying. Options B, C, and D are referenced in the passage. The passage does at least imply that the narrator has a bad relationship with her husband because she doesn't feel like she can tell him what she wants to do or where she wants to stay. Option C is also implied when the narrator states that the entire reason for being at the country house is so that she can recover from an illness. Option D is also implied when the narrator mentions that she enjoys writing, but that John does not want her to write. Remember, in summary questions, most of the wrong answers are either based on an inference or a specific detail from the passage, but none of them are the main idea. Question 6. Supporting details. Which of the following details support the idea that the narrator's husband is controlling? A. The paint and paper look as if a boys' school had used it. It is stripped off the paper in great patches all around the head of my bed. B. It was a nursery first, then playground and gymnasium, I should judge, for the windows are barred for little children. C. I never saw worse paper in my life, one of those sprawling, flamboyant patterns committing every artistic sin. Or D. He is very careful and loving, and hardly lets me stir without special direction. The correct answer is D. He is very careful and loving, and hardly lets me stir without special direction. Note: although the narrator describes him as loving, the love comes with his special direction. While the barred windows may seem to suggest control, it is important to remember that they are moving into an existing house and that the bars were left behind by a previous owner. Question 7. Inference. Based on the passage, what can you infer about the narrator's relationship with her husband? A. The narrator seems to be in control, and her husband attempts to keep her happy. B. The narrator's husband seems to be physically abusive. C. The narrator's husband seems to be in control of many aspects of her life. Or D. The narrator seems to be contemplating leaving her husband. The correct answer is C. Based on the passage, you can infer that the narrator's husband seems to be in control of many aspects of her life, from the discussion of the room in which the couple will stay, to the discussion of him having a prescription for every hour of her day, to her reference that he does not care for her writing. All these details seem to suggest that he is in control of many aspects of the narrator's life. The following passage is from Treasure Island by Robert Louis Stevenson. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea-chest following behind him in a hand-barrow, a tall, strong, heavy, nut-brown man, his tarry pigtails falling over the shoulder of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black, broken nails, and the saber cut across one cheek a dirty, livid white. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards, 15 men on the dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho and a bottle of rum, in the high old tottering voice that seemed to have been tuned and broken at the capstan bars. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of a stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. "This is a handy cove," says he at length. "A pleasantly situated grog shop. Much company, mate?" My father told him no, very little company, the more was the pity. "Well, then," said he, "this is the berth for me. Here you, matey," he cried to the man who trundled the barrow. "Bring up alongside and help up my chest. I'll stay here a bit," he continued. "I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want, and that head up there for to watch ships off. What you might call me captain. Oh, I see what you're at there." And he threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. "You can tell me when I've worked through that," says he, looking as fierce as a commander. Question 8. Summary and main idea. What seems to be the captain's main purpose in the passage? A. Renting a room at an inn that also provides food. B. Hiding from the law. C. Finding a place to hide his treasure. Or D. Getting the innkeeper to become a member of his crew. The correct answer is A. The captain's main purpose is renting a room at an inn that also provides food. Because he does want a place where he can see who's coming, we do get the idea that he may be hiding. And he does have a chest which may or may not contain treasure. We don't have any indication that the innkeeper is trying to be recruited into his crew. So our best answer is that his main purpose is renting the room. Question 9. Details. Which detail in the passage suggests that the captain has plenty of money? A. A heavy nut-brown man, his tarry pigtail falling over the shoulder of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black broken nails, and the saber cut across one cheek. B. I'll stay here a bit, he continued. I'm a plain man. Rum and bacon and eggs is what I want. C. Much company, mate? My father told him no. Very little company. The more was the pity. Well then, said he, this is the berth for me. Or D. He threw down 3 or 4 gold pieces on the threshold. You can tell me when I've worked through that. The correct answer is D. The detail in the passage that suggests the captain has plenty of money is him throwing down the 3 or 4 gold pieces and telling the innkeeper to let him know when he's worked through it. Question 10. Details. Which of the following details indicate that the captain may come from a rough background? A. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste, and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. B. Heavy nut-brown man, his tarry pigtails falling over the shoulder of his soiled blue coat, his hands ragged and scarred, with black broken nails, and the saber cut across one cheek. C. I remember him as if it were yesterday, as he came plodding to the inn door, his sea-chest following behind him in a hand-barrow. Or D. 15 men on a dead man's chest, yo-ho-ho, and a bottle of rum. The correct answer is B. The detail that indicates the captain may come from a rough background is that his hands are ragged and scarred with broken nails, and that he has a saber cut across one cheek. Question 11. Details. At what time do the events in the passage seem to have happened? A. The events of the passage seem to be hypothetical, fanciful, a story that has not actually happened. B. The events of the passage seem to be the narrator recounting something that happened in the past. C. The events of the passage seem to be happening in the present, and the narrator is describing them as they happen. Or D. The events of the passage seem to be something that the narrator is expecting to see happen in the future. Question 11. Details. At what time do the events in the passage seem to have happened? The correct answer is B. The events of the passage seem to be the narrator recounting something happening in the past. Question 12. Inference. Which detail suggests that the captain may be hiding from someone? A. This, when it was brought to him, he drank slowly like a connoisseur, lingering on the taste and still looking about him at the cliffs and up at our signboard. B. Much company, mate? My father told him no, very little company. The more was the pity. Well then, he said, this is the berth for me. C. Then he rapped on the door with a bit of a stick like a handspike that he carried, and when my father appeared, called roughly for a glass of rum. Or D. I remember him looking round the cove and whistling to himself as he did so, and then breaking out in that old sea song that he sang so often afterwards. The correct answer is B. The detail that suggests the captain may be hiding from someone is when he asks if many people visit the inn. When he says, "Much company, mate," he's trying to find out if there are many visitors, and when he finds out that there are not, he decides, "This is the berth for me." This detail suggests that he may be hiding from someone. Review question types. The first type of question we looked at was the summary and main idea question. These questions will ask you to summarize information presented in a passage or paragraph, or to differentiate the main idea of the passage from the supporting details. The second type of questions we looked at were supporting details questions. These will ask you to identify supporting details in the passage and to evaluate new information to determine whether it would support the main idea of the passage. And finally, we looked at inference questions. These questions will ask you to use information in the passage to make a logical inference about something that is not explicitly stated in the passage. Review. Answer strategy. Summary and main idea. On summary and main idea questions, scan the first and last paragraphs or the first and last sentences of a passage. Identify the main idea. What is the most important point? Supporting details. Supporting details give you additional information about the main idea. Where summary and main idea questions look for the big picture, these questions will cause you to look back to the text for specific pieces of textual evidence. Inference questions. The answer to these questions will not be directly stated in the text. Your answer must be based on the text and provide a logical extension that can be justified by the information in the text.